Now, with the knowledge that there are Yeti stories, Bigfoot stories, Sasquatch stories happening pretty much all over, it's kind of interesting to see how the description that we have given previously actually matches a much broader type of character. For example, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is probably, at least as far as we have found so far, the oldest written story on Earth, dating back to 25 to 2700 years before Common Era, tells us of the stories of well, Gilgamesh, hence the name. So this is a series of story found on clay tablets, so etched in cuneiform script, and it tells us the stories of this king who was up to all kinds of hijinks back in his day. And so Gilgamesh is kind of a hero character, and he is created by the gods, of course, by the fact that he is a hero, but he is also kind of a boundless human. He can't really approach people without killing them. He kind of sucks the lifeblood out of people, and that's kind of his lot in life, I suppose. But because that makes him pretty miserable, the gods decide to create a counterpart to Gilgamesh, and that counterpart is this character right here, posted in the picture that looks a little bit pretty large, pretty hairy, pretty dark. So the goddess conceived an image in her mind, and that was of the stuff of Anu of the firmament. She dipped her hands in water and pitched tough clay, and she let it fall in the wilderness, and the noble Enkidu was created. There was virtue in him of the god of war, of Ninurta himself. His body was rough, he had long hair like a woman's. It waved like the hair of Nisaba, the goddess of corn. His body was covered with matted hair like Samukhans, the god of cattle. He was innocent of mankind. He knew nothing of the cultivated land. So we have this weird character that is a counterpart to the gods that seems to be very human, made out of clay, kind of the biblical Adam, except this one is hairy, like an animal, like the god of cattle, but also long hair, like a woman, but also with a rough body, but also the virtue of the god of war. So it seems like this kind of uncontrollable type of character who eventually learns how to behave from hanging out with Gilgamesh, and the two of them represent this kind of deadly duo, if you will, where one has this unlimited, unconstrained power, Gilgamesh, that is, and the other, Enkidu, being this wild character that is so basically human. And in fact, kind of like us and our Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti types, we tend to see that there is this kind of opposite character that appears in those figures, very different from us, but at the same time very similar. And of course, there's a pretty obvious example in terms of big, hairy humans that exist in more common mythology that are Titans. In Greek mythology, the god of heaven, Uranus, and the goddess of earth, Gaia, have 12 children, six boys, six girls, and the six of them are known as the original Titans. And there's Oceanus and Creus and Lepidus and Cronus, and there's Thea and Rhea and Phoebe, and etc. The Titans are the kind of quintessential former gods, the first generation preceding the Olympian gods, who are overthrown as part of the Greek mythology, the Greek succession story. Cronus tried to steal the power from his father and try to rule the cosmos with the Titans. But of course, Zeus did not abide by this and upset the this succession line and installed himself and the Olympians as the rulers of Earth, following a war that lasted 10 years. And as a result of that, the Titans are banished from the upper world and they are sent into Tartarus, a kind of a wild figure, if you will. It's not quite the underworld. It's not quite heavens, of course, because that would be sending him back to his parents. Tartarus is this kind of almost like hell, but not quite hell. This is, where the losers go, essentially. Um, And according to a story, some of those Titans every now and then were able to break free from Tartarus and would roam the earth and occasionally, and the gods would have to come back and get them to return them back to Tartarus. So again, this part of the story, there is this counterpart to the gods, these not quite human, not quite like us characters that are able to be seen every now and then according to a weird ritual that would send them back to wherever they come from. And again, these characters are bigger than us. They are taller than us. They are quite not like the gods, but closer to the gods than we are. And of course, the most common myth that most people know of large, tall people would appear in the Bible. And in Genesis, there is a race of giants who are on the earth. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, so the same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. So there used to be, according to the biblical narrative, giants that used to exist on earth with us, around us, but they because of their relationship with us had to be banished into some kind of an other world once again. But the giants existed before us. Again, whether that's a human ancestor or what, it's not exactly clear, but that is what the myth tells us. And those giants ended up having sexual or relationships or bearing children to the children of men, and those men eventually caused the gods to be very unhappy, or the god, I call it the Abrahamic God, to be unhappy and to cause the flood, after which the rest of us were born. So again, a giant character that exists out there that we might have been in contact with in the distant past, but we are no longer in distance with. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old men of renown. This is a different translation of the same text. They're named Nephilim, no longer named giants, because the translation of the Bible, the early translations of the Bible, seem to have a little bit of a poetic license and might have caused some confusion around the Middle Ages, where people used to think that there were actual giants on Earth. Um, kind of inspiring the stories of Geoffrey of Monmouth that we have mentioned before. So the newer translations, such as the New International Version, NIV, uses this word Nephilim instead of giant because, well, we don't want people to be confused. We don't want people to believe that there were actual giants out there. There are these angel-like, giant-like characters, and kind of a little bit less descriptive language to be sure, but perhaps, there might be something whose imagination could tell you that is kind of like a human, kind of not like a human. That being said, we don't have to look that far into the Old Testament to find giants, because as you might know, there's a pretty well-known giant that exists in the more recent Bible narrative. In the first book of Samuel, there's a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, who came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Um, well, lots to say about this, of course, but you probably know the story of David and Goliath, this giant who is defeated by David, the poorly human, with, of course, his cunning, whereas Goliath, the giant, is defeated. Now, 6 cubits in a span, who's to say what that means exactly? There are different explanations in biblical commentary that explains how tall that is. Could be 6 feet, could be 9 feet. Who's to say? Between 2 and 3 meters, so tall, but not so tall or very tall. Who's to say? Similarly, with the shekels, that's a little bit easier to make sense out of. 125 pounds is supposed to weigh, which is pretty skinny if the guy is 9 feet tall. His spear is 15 pounds, so kind of weaving a heavy armor. So generally tall guy, mythical tall guy. The Philistines are, at least as far as we know, as the historical narrative, Philistines are part of Canaan, so technically the same population group as the story of the Bible. They share an ancestry, although, as we know from the biblical narrative, those people are at war for a good part of their history as well. So they are, well, kind of like the Canaanites, but also kind of different enough that you might have to fight them. That being said, there are some commentary that explain that perhaps this Goliath character might have been a mercenary who was hired by the Philistines to fight. So perhaps he is not in fact a Philistine, but he could be kind of a weapon of war, if you will, but he would still have to be kind of a neighbor close enough to be like the Philistines, even though he might not be entirely human like the rest of us. Um, so, in terms of the myth, in terms of the character, in terms of the tradition, it is absolutely not rare to find these giant characters, these scary characters that are kind of out there and that may turn out to be a threat to the rest of us. Even closer to us, there are some stories in the Middle Ages that tell us of these giants, and now these giants tend to be a lot more closer to the forest type characters as we see from Sasquatch and the Yeti and whatnot. This is an illustration by Bruegel the Elder, dated from 1566. It appears in a series of stories from the Middle Ages as well, from Valentine and Orson, twin brothers who are abandoned in the woods in infancy. Valentine is brought up as a knight in the court of the French king, while Orson is growing up in a bear's den, raised by animals. Orson turns out to be a feral child, feral man of some sort. And of course, Valentine eventually finds him and tames him to become his servant and friend. Now, because this is a folk tale, there are various versions of the story, and sometimes they figure out that they are in fact friends and brothers, sorry, separated at birth, and so knowing that they are brothers, they kind of have to rekindle their friendship and rekindle their relationship until they have to find their parents again. And some others, they just spend their time fighting. The folk tales kind of tend to have different versions, and we'll get to that a little bit later into these classes as we go. But here, a brother of a human who is raised by animals and has to be re-educated, returned into a human like the rest of us. Something that is kind of a goal maybe in very many Sasquatch stories. They're trying to find Sasquatch and make friends with him, unless, of course, he needs to be hunted and chased like a wild animal. We'll talk about that a little bit more on Friday. Geoffrey of Monmouth, of course, that we have mentioned before, is a storyteller and had all kinds of stories, including stories of the Arthurian knights and what was happening to Merlin. Merlin, typically pictured as a wizard, of course, or as a mage, if you will, depending on how closely you like your fantasy. Your fantasy vocabulary, some kind of magical being, if you will. But he has all kinds of roles because he is a mythical figure. But Geoffrey of Monmouth told many of these Merlin stories, and in some of these stories, the Merlin is driven into the woods by madness. The madness that drives people into the woods is an intermittent phenomenon punctuated by periods of lucidity during which Merlin allows himself to be brought back to his native haunts. Accordingly, the state of insanity is not imperious to treatment and can be alleviated temporarily by the application of music as a palliative. Only when his insanity has full sway over him does Merlin act under the compulsion to be a wild man. Then, quote unquote, fury seizes him. He enters the woods. There, he becomes a sylvan man and finds only pleasure in watching the wild animals while himself is hidden like a beast. So here, Merlin is part human, part wild, and can be tamed with the sound of music, but can be also driven mad, in which case he acts like a wild man in the forest. So the possibility of Sasquatch of this Bigfoot character being a human driven into the woods is also pretty realistic in this case. It would be, if he is abandoned in the woods like Orson, or if he is taken into some kind of a rage of a situation where humans are becoming too tired to him. Finding refuge in the woods is a pretty safe place for this human, not quite human. There is Grendel as well. Grendel, who is not a giant, at least not in a traditional story, but Grendel is this counterpart to Beowulf. There's no known author to the story of Beowulf, but another very common middle of the story from the middle of the last millennium. Started as a poem, but of course it is told into a variety of ways. The oldest manuscript that we have dates back from the turn of the millennium and keeps on continuing into various forms. Grendel is typically pictured as a troll, and the troll itself is kind of a weird figure that is sometimes pictured as very tall or not so tall. That's kind of what happens with the stories. But trolls are typically pretty hairy, kind of humans, but kind of animals, and sometimes behaving a little bit more like an ape, like they behave like humans. Um, the story of Grendel, of course, is that he needs to be defeated by the hero Beowulf. When she got to Beowulf and pledged to kill Grendel for her or be himself killed. After that, I had quiet words for Unforth. He was a reliable teller of tales, though a troublemaker. There was, he said, a tale of Heorot, Hill being an ancient burial place. Unforth had sung the tale to King Hrothgar, and but had that not prevented Hrothgar building Heorot right on the mountain's summit. Who did the tale say was buried there? Giants, Unferth told me. Buried by giant kin who had the power to cast spells. Elfahir was silent for a moment. Wiglaf said, Grendel was a troll, though, not a giant. Could he have used spell? Well, could he? Grendel, being a troll, could be related to the giants, could have some kind of, again, weird ancestry coming from these mythical characters, and perhaps he might have been contaminated by magic somehow. Who's to say? But if Grendel is an opposite, it might be that he is an opposite as the result of a longer story that we are not aware of. And as much as we can assume that trolls have certain powers, we only know so much about them. They could have magical power for hiding, for fighting, for whatever it is. So the figure of kind of a halfway trickster, halfway human keeps following us over the years. There's a pretty common also trope that exists in Shakespeare from The Tempest. I like to use The Tempest pretty often in my courses because it has a pretty good story, and it includes this freckled whelp named Caliban, who is also pictured as an abandoned child who kind of has to raise himself partly, but also is isolated from humans for a very long time and is eventually adopted like a slave. This blue-eyed hag was hither brought with child, and here was left by the sailors. Thou, my slave, as thou reports thyself, was then her servant. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthy and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hest, she did confine thee by help of her more potent ministers, and in her most unmitigable rage into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned thou didst painful remain a dozen years. Within a space she died and left thee there, where thou didst vent thy groans as far as mill-wheat strike. Then was this island, save for the sun that she did litter here, a freckled-wept hag-born, not honored with a human shape. Yes, Caliban, our son. Again, Caliban, not particularly well described, but son of a blue-eyed hag, witch, but not quite a witch character. Again, something that is pretty close to the humans, but by their behavior exhibiting not so human killer qualities. So what is this thing? What is this Caliban character? What is this Orson? What is this Grendel? What is this kind of antagonist that exists in our world, but not so antagonistic that it can be tamed or turned into somebody like us. This is obviously something that is pretty common for many people, including outside of the English-speaking world. This story here from The Monkey, A Journey to the West, tells us of a person that is monkey-like, but also human-like, also created by the gods, also pretty close to us, but also very different. I see, the patriarch said, for he was pleased. In other words, you were born of heaven and earth. Now stand up and walk around so I can see all sides of you. I will need to give your name. There's a word I use for each division and year of my teaching, which consists of 10 worlds and 12 worlds in all. What are the 12 words? Monkey asked. They are wide, great, wise, sharp, true, conforming, nature, ocean, quick, aware, complete, awakened. Since you fall in the 10th generation of my teaching, your name must include the word aware. Your religious name, therefore, will be aware of vacuity. So this is a monkey, conspicuously pictured as a monkey, and the illustration picture it as a monkey, as you can see on the right there. And the monkey's name is typically translated or brought to us as Sun Wukong. The Sun Wukong is this monkey-like character who eventually figures out that he feels a little bit better away from his monkey friends, although he does play with them for a while. He comes out to be a monkey king of some sort, playing with them, but eventually Sun Wukong, being the Monkey King or handsome Monkey King, eventually is not happy. His friends die, and as a result of that, um, he seeks knowledge outside of his friends and tries to become immortal, tries to beat death. To avoid feeling the same shape and the same sadness that he has felt before. Um, and he eventually meets some humans from whom he tries to learn their magical ways, but the humans see a monkey and they run away from him. They can't live with him. They can't deal with him. And of course, the monkey understands the handsome monkey understands that they might be scared, so he dresses up like a human and starts to learn their ways, starts to walk like them, starts to read books like them, hides his face so that it's not as scary, and eventually starts hiding in the forest close enough to the humans to live with them, but far enough that they are not too scared about them. And of course, again, pretty similar character to what we have seen a lot so far. So in this case, we have this pretty recurring trope that is very common in most stories in most parts of the world. And it kind of figures out as some kind of an ancestor to these Sasquatches and Bigfoots and Yetis and whatnot. Now, can we really trace a parentage between these stories, these common folk tales, and the modern versions of what we see there? Of course, there are differences, but of course, the stories change depending on place. And, our technology, our pictures of what these monkey-like beings are, is obviously very different from year to year. So there is probably a little bit of an appeal there to these stories that sound very common to us and a somewhat familiar shape to the stories, to these humans that themselves have a familiar shape to us. Um, again, we can't really trace an exact line because there's chances are that the average person who appreciates a good Sasquatch or a Bigfoot story is even vaguely aware of, even Shakespeare or Beowulf or any one of those. But because it is part of our tapestry of stories, it is also very easy to see the appeal of a Sasquatch story in that context.